In the history of Boomzap, I don't know. Monica knows the real number. It's like 50 games or something like that. We've made a lot of games. I don't remember how many, but it's a metric ton of games. So we've got this big team making all these games, and Paj asked, he said, how come I only ever hear about Callasia and Last Regiment? What's the story about that? And the quick answer is we do a lot of different kinds of games. We do games that are made for different audiences. And one of the nice things about the modern world of media is you can be very selective in which media channel you choose and where you actually present your information to the world. And so, for instance, we did a game called Kathy's Crafts. Kathy's Crafts is a time management game where a young woman who's running a crafting goods store has to run around and stock the shelves full of yarn and knitting goods and that sort of thing. Now, honestly, a bunch of the people who are here wanting to play a game with orcs and elves fighting each other over a fantasy world are probably not that interested in stocking a store with crafting goods. I mean, there may be a little bit of crossover, but we know that there's other media channels where there are a lot of people who are interested in a game like that. And so we focus our marketing for that kind of game on those media channels, and we focus the marketing for this kind of game on these media channels. And so there's different places that you can go. But it got me thinking, and one of the other things I should mention about that is we do some projects with publishers. We do some projects as self-published projects. And so one of the reasons we don't do a lot of marketing for some of our other games is because they're done for publishers. And publishers have marketing departments. And marketing departments don't like it when you step all over their toes and you say, okay, here's how I'm going to market this game. And they're like, no, we have a whole marketing department. They have a whole plan, and your thing that you're doing isn't part of our plan, so stop it. So generally, when we're working with a publisher, we just kind of let them handle the marketing because they got a thing that they want to do, and we don't get in the face about it. And so that got into the question of, well, who's a publisher and who's a developer and blah, 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 blah. And I thought, you know what? Maybe it would be interesting to do this is Chris's guide to how the game industry works. This is my idiot's guide to the game industry. So for anyone who's interested, boom, let's do that thing. So if you want to understand how the game industry works and why it works in the way it does, you got to kind of hop in the old Wayback Machine with me and go back in time to the deep 90s, when most of what we understand as the current game industry sort of took form. There certainly was a game industry before the early 90s. There was Atari and ColecoVision and all that. And if you're interested in the ancient history of the game development world, then that's great. But what we kind of understand is how things work, sort of put together in that time. And at that time, you have to understand how games got made and how they got sold, right? And keep in mind, this is in the very, very early days of the internet, predating internet for some of this, right? So you couldn't just, right now you can go on the internet and say, I wonder what this game is like, and you find all the information you want. The world used to not be like that. And so back in those days, back in the Stone Ages, the main players in the game industry were, if you're looking at who was involved, there was obviously the people who were playing games. There were the users, so to speak. There were the distributors, and the distributors at that time were brick and mortar distributors. They were Walmart and Best Buy and Kmart and Target, places like that. And, if you wanted a game, there was no downloading a game. You had to walk into a store and buy a box with a CD in it and bring the CD home. When I started games, in fact, it was buy a box with floppy disks in it and bring the box of floppy disks home, right? And so somebody had to be the person who sold the box of floppy disks, right? And that was generally... there were a bunch of small game stores, but what really mattered were the sort of big box stores, the Walmarts and the Best Buys of the world. And so people really cared about Walmart and Best Buy because that's where you sold most of your games. So how did you get your floppy disk into a box with Walmart? Well, first of all, you had to make a floppy disk. So there were manufacturers, and the manufacturers, they didn't care about anything because they were just paid to make disks, right? So somebody would give them an order and say, I need 500,000 discs of Doom, and they would print out 500,000 discs of Doom, and they would sell you to, and they would make, 10 cents a copy on the discs. And beyond that, they didn't give a shit. They were just people who made stuff. So we can kind of discount them as anyone who was a meaningful player. They didn't make any decisions in this. They just printed stuff. So who paid to have those discs made? Was publishers, right? And so really you end up with the three big parties involved in making a game, were the publishers, the distributors, and the developers, right? And most people don't know the names of developers. They don't know, if people who are on this Twitch and they're in the video games, they know they're developers. But the vast majority of people who play video games don't actually know who the developers are, right? They know Electronic Arts and they know Sony and Microsoft, and those are publishers, right? And what would happen is the publishers would decide to make a game, and they would give a big piece of money to a developer and say, here's some money, go make a game. And the developer would make that game with that money, and then they would give it back to the publisher, and the publisher would say, great, you made a game. And they would go to the distributors, and they would say to the distributors, we have a game, would you like to put this game on your shelf? And the distributors would buy a certain number of copies. And this is where E3 comes from. For those of you who don't know what E3 is, it's the Electronics Entertainment Expo. It's in Los Angeles every year, and it's one of the oldest game shows in the world, and it's still one of the most important. And it was the first consumer show. Now, its original incarnation was to sort of facilitate this thing. And if you, again, remember, this is back in the days when you had to print stuff, right? And so somebody had to figure out how many copies of, Spyro the Dragon are we going to make this year? And back then, most people got their games around Christmas. You bought games other times, but the huge bulk, that was the big season, was it? At Christmas, everybody was going to go out and get their new console and get some new games. And so the Christmas season was the big season. So the big question was, how many copies of Spyro the Dragon is Best Buy going to order for Christmas? And in time for them to figure out how many copies they needed and print them out and do the marketing and all the other whatnot, they actually needed to know that information all the way back in like late spring, early summer. And so that's why E3 was set in late spring, early summer. And it was designed as a marketplace for the guys from Best Buy, Walmart, and all the other game shops to come in, look at all the games, and there would be people from the publishers who would say, oh, Spyro's great. You really need to buy 500,000 copies of Spyro. And they would mark down, oh, this is what we need, right? The problem is the guys who are making those decisions at Best Buy and Walmart, they're not real sure if it's the right decision. I mean, they go and they look, but maybe they missed a game. Maybe they missed out on some sort of, sleeper hit or something like that. So how do they know that they looked at all the games? And this is where the game press comes from. And you think that the game press was there to get users excited about games. Originally, it was sort of less that. It was actually more about, can I build enough hype about this game that the distributors think this game is good enough that I can go put all these games on the shelf, because the distributors had to go buy copies. And remember, there's a manufacturer who's making all these CDs, and once they've made all the CDs and put them in a box and sent them away, they're done. You can't send those back to the manufacturer. They were told to make 500,000 copies of this game, and they've made it, and they're done, and they got their money, they're over. So somebody is now the proud owner of 500,000 copies of Spyro the Dragon, and they have to sell it or not sell it, right? And so the agreements that the publishers would make with the distributors sometimes involved buybacks and blah, blah, blah. And there's nothing worse than like the distributor saying, hey, we bought 500,000 copies of your game and we sold 20. Here, have 490,000 and change of them back. Do your best with it, right? Somebody over in chat is mentioning E.T. Yeah, this is the classic story of that, where they had so many copies of E.T. that they literally, I'm not making this up, dug a big hole in the desert and buried them out in the desert in New Mexico. That's a real story, right? And what happens when the manufacturer makes more copies of a game than anybody wants. And the person who loses money in that is the publisher. That's who gets hit, right? And when you talk about publishers, you're talking about the EAs and the Activisions and the Blizzards. I guess Activision and Blizzard's the same company now. They used to not be. The Ubisofts, those kind of big companies. Now, the media basically became sort of a gatekeeper for who's making the good game, and they would go around. So E3 became sort of a media circus, and it became all about the publishers putting up these great big booths, kind of like a peacock putting up its feathers and saying, come look at me. And you would, to attract, because, you didn't have to put up your booth to attract the buyers. The buyers had a list of where they needed to go, and they would go down the list with a little handler that would drag them around, right? What they needed was they needed the media, who didn't know any better, to come and to develop hype for games. And again, remember, this isn't internet media. Back then, if you wanted to be a game reporter, The media was magazines, and somebody actually had to print copies of magazines and send them to people's houses or to game stores that people would buy. And so it wasn't this world that we have now where like anyone and their dog can have an opinion about a game on the Amazon site. You had to actually have a valid opinion. You had to prove to people that your opinion was good, and you had to do it time and time again, and people had to trust in your opinion. There used to be a world where game critics actually had skills. It was nice back then. I mean, we didn't always like the critics, and sometimes the critics were shitty human beings. But if a critic time and time again gave a bad review about a game that was good or a good review about a game that was bad, sooner or later the magazine wouldn't hire them anymore. And so they had to actually have some sort of, ability to write and to criticize and to know something about games. And so that was sort of the world that we lived in. Now, the business part of that world, where the money moved around in that world, the big part of that was the relationship between the publishers, the developers, and the distributors. Now, the distributors, they would agree to buy X number of games at X price, and if it didn't sell, then they would get X buyback price from the publisher to protect them against buying too many copies. That was a pretty straightforward, simple deal, and you could find a deal like that in almost any retail business. It's just a retail business. If you go down to Walmart and ask them how many sofas they bought, it's under a similar condition, right? It's just a retail business, right? So the sort of squirrely bit, the part where people start losing a lot of money, is in that publisher-developer relationship. And so let's talk about that for a minute and how that works. And the heart of this is, you've got a developer and he wants to make a game, but he doesn't have enough money to make a game. You've got a publisher. Now, they've got lots of money. And there's two ways that they can make a game. Actually, there's three ways they can make a game. The number one way that they can make a game is they can just say, fine, let's hire a bunch of people, put them in our publishing studio, and let's make a game ourselves. That's called first-party publishing. Perfect example of that, Blizzard's World of Warcraft, right? Blizzard didn't hire anybody to make World of Warcraft for them. There's a big group of people inside of Blizzard, which is a publisher, that made World of Warcraft. They didn't hire anyone to do that. So in that, it's very straightforward. The publisher puts all the money into the deal. The publisher owns all the intellectual property, and the publisher makes a game. Done. Straightforward, right? Now, the problem is the publisher doesn't really want to have to grow to, because if you think about what the publisher does all the marketing, and they deal with the distributors and blah, blah, blah. And once they've put a chain together for doing that marketing and doing that distribution and all of that stuff, there's an obvious pull for them to say, well, we've already built this whole structure for delivering games for our game. Why don't we put another game through that same structure? Let's go build another game. That's a very obvious next step in the sort of mental process. And so, all right, let's hire up a whole nother team and make a whole nother game and blah, 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 blah. Let's not just have Warcraft. Let's also have StarCraft. Woo, off you go, right? But at some point, your publishing studio gets really big. And you start saying, wow, we built all of these games to push through the pipeline, and now we have to hire a bunch of people and fire a bunch of people. And it becomes a sort of large, unwieldy structure, and you move very slowly, because when you want to make a new game or cancel a game or something like that, you're talking about hiring or firing a whole lot of people, and it becomes a large risk for the publisher. So at some point in that process, the publisher says, hey, you know what, we could offer to let somebody else come in and make a game for us, and then we'll run it through all the structure that we built for marketing it and distributing it and putting it on the shelves and all that other stuff, right? And so that's where the third party relationship is created. The third party relationship means there's somebody else out there who's going to make the game for you, and then you're going to so in this case, I'm trying to think of a good example. Here's a perfect example. I in one of the relationships I was in, I made Far Cry. I made Far Cry at a company called Crytek. At that time, Crytek was only a developer, and Crytek didn't have the money to make Far Cry. So they went to Ubisoft and said, we'd like to make this game, and we'd like you to give us a bunch of money to make this game, and we would like to put it through your publishing channels. And Ubisoft said, okay. So what's the process by which you do that? Well, in that particular case, the Early brothers were pretty bright fellows and very good salesmen, and they had built a demo called the Dinosaur Island demo, which was not the game that they were going to make, but it was a proof that they could make something, and it had pretty cool graphics in it. And they actually made that as a demo for, I think, the NVIDIA card. And so, anyway, with that demo, they convinced Ubisoft that they could make this game, that they had a design document for, and they got the money to make the game. Now that's one way about to go about doing it. Somebody over in chat is asking about Monsters Inc., which is another game that I made, and actually that's a nice it's a nice other example, because that was an example that went in the other direction, right? How did because at that time I worked for a small studio called Kodiak. And Kodiak, again, was not a publisher. They were a developer. And Disney, who obviously owns Monsters, Inc. Actually, at the time, Pixar owned Monster, Inc. I don't think Pixar was owned by Disney yet. I think that happened after that. I don't remember exactly how it worked. But there was Pixar and there was Disney involved. But in any case, Disney was the publisher. And Disney wanted a game made for Monsters, Inc., and they wanted someone else to do it because they didn't have enough people in their studio to make it. So they went out to a third party. They went out to Kodiak and said, can you make a Monsters Inc. game for us? So here's sort of the opposite. Sometimes it's the developer coming to a publisher with an idea. Hey, we'd like to make this game. Sometimes it's the publisher going out to the developer and saying, hey, we've got a game that we want to make. In either one of those situations, now you have to figure out sort of the three big parts of the deal. Number one, what is the prepaid going to be? And the prepay is how much money is the publisher going to give the developer to make the game? That's called prepaids, because it's paid before you make the game, right? It's a prepaid. And so the prepaids in any deal is money that the publisher never sees again. It's not a loan, in the sense that you owe it back. So let's take a hypothetical situation. A publisher decides they want to publish game X. And they say, for game X, we're going to pay you $1 million. Here's an upfront. Now, of course, they don't pay it as a check. They don't just hand you $1 million and you have your way with it. They schedule it over a number of milestones. So they say, over the development of this game, we're going to give you $1 million, and we'll give you $100,000 right now when you sign the agreement, and we'll give you another $200,000 when you reach alpha, and we'll give you another $300,000 when you reach beta, blah 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 blah. And so now, what's going to happen in the studios is the developer is going to be trying to reach those milestones so that they can get their next check, so that they can pay their staff. And the publisher is going to try to get as much work out of the developer as they can in between milestones to protect themselves, right? Because if they look at an alpha and the alpha is not very good, they'll throw it back at the developer and say, that's not very good. We don't believe in that. You need to fix this, or we're not going to pay you the milestone. So that's the sort of tension that exists for the prepaids, right? So that's part one. What is my prepaids going to be? Part two is, what's my royalty rate going to be? And the royalty rate is at the end of this process, when we're done making the game and the publisher goes out and makes the game and starts selling the game, how much money is the developer going to make? Is he going to make 10%? Make 50%? Is he going to make 75%? How much of the take from the publisher is the developer going to make? That's a very interesting discussion. And importantly, one of the reasons prepaids, and there's two ways you can look at the money that the game developer gets at the front. One is called a dev budget, and one is called prepaids. If you get a dev budget, then that means during the development of the game, you get some money and we never talk about it again. That very, very rarely happens. Usually you get what's called prepaids. And prepaids means I am paying you the royalties that you are going to earn when the game ships, but I am paying you those royalties before the game ships because you need them to make the game. So now let's say we decide that the revenue split's going to be 70% publisher, 30% developer. Merlin is asking over in chat, by the way, what is the industry standard for dev cut? There's not a standard. There's not like a particular number, but it's something like 70-30. Depends on, and these, think of these as levers that you pull, right? So one lever might be, if you get a bigger dev budget, you might get a smaller back end, which is what we call the royalty rate. So I give you $1 million up front and you get 30%. Or maybe if you're willing to take more risk, I only give you $800,000 up front, but you get 35%, right? So there's a negotiation to be had there. But I would say, in general, if you're a reasonable studio and people know what you're doing, and the 70-30 split is not too weird. Maybe 75-25. It's gone down over time. We're going to talk about that in a minute because there's a whole conversation. But back in the day, back in the golden age of game development, it used to be about 70-30. I believe, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this or not. I believe at Far Cry it was, I think they managed like 34%, something like that. It was a pretty good percentage. So when you start earning those royalties, the first thing you have to do is earn out your prepaids. And this is something a lot of people don't understand. And by the way, this thing I'm explaining, this is a basic entertainment model. If you were working with a book publisher, if you were working with a music publisher, this is kind of how entertainment works. So if you're in this situation, the developer is kind of like your favorite rock and roll band, and the publisher is kind of like Sony Music, right? And so this is a very similar relationship that a music recording artist has, right? And someone is saying over in chat that, obviously in novels, this is a very similar thing. So, and this is a bit where people don't understand things and they get all butthurt because they don't understand the problem. The prepaids are a prepaid, right? And that means, let's say the game makes $1 million and you are making 30% royalties. Great. What's 30% of $1 million? $300,000. Great. I make $300,000. Wait a minute. You got $1 million in prepaids. So now your $300,000 has gone to pay back your prepaids, right? Because you've already been paid $1 million. So until your royalty rate reaches $1 million, not when the game earns $1 million, but when your royalty percentage earns $1 million, then you have paid out your prepaids. Now you can start earning more money. And a lot of people get really torqued off about this because they don't understand this. And they're like, my game made $4 million and I didn't make any money. And you're like, well, yeah, you didn't pay back your prepaids. And they didn't understand this. It's surprising how many people don't understand that, right? So those are the two biggest levers, right? What is my prepaid? What is my back-end royalty going to make? And you can certainly, if you've got a game that you believe in a lot or a game that you've already got pretty far in development, you can pull those prepaids way down. And in return for pulling those prepaids way down and removing risk from the publisher, you can jack your back-end royalties way up. And so, all right, now I'm going to pay out my back-end royalties a lot faster. And then after that, I'm going to earn more money faster. Now, there's a lot of other shenanigans that you can do about that. Okay, you can have your royalty rates move up after you hit a certain milestone of sales and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to get into that, but there's all kinds of shenanigans you can play with those numbers. But those are the two big numbers. The third lever of the three levers that we care about is IP ownership. And this is, who owns this? And this is a question that we get at Boomzap a lot. For those of you who know about our hidden object games, we made a series called Awakening. It's a great series, made millions of dollars. We loved it. We enjoyed making it. We had a great time. We love the users that made it. This is a huge part of the success of Boomzap. And still today, we're earning royalty checks from Awakening that's going to pay for this game and other games. That's something that's still happening. And people have asked, hey, this is a really successful game. Why don't you use the Awakening brand in your games? Why don't you make another Awakening game? Blah, blah, blah. We don't own that intellectual property. Part of the reason why we got higher prepaids when we made that game and had a higher royalty rate, remember, these are three levers that you can pull. The third lever over here, I wish I had a third hand. I could put three levers with three hands. Anyway, the third lever was we don't own that intellectual property. That's actually owned by Big Fish. We can't make an Awakening game any more than I could make a Mickey Mouse game or Spyro the Dragon game. I don't own the rights to Mickey Mouse. I don't own the rights to Spyro the Dragon. I also don't own the rights to Awakening or Dana Nightstone or the rights to a number of other products. And that seems weird to a lot of people, and they get really butthurt about it. And they're like, why is it that you made a game but you don't own the rights? But you made it. Making something doesn't matter for shit in the entertainment industry. Paying for something matters in the entertainment industry, right? If you want to own something, the fact that you, with your little hands, made it makes fuck all difference. And as a creative person, as an artist working in the entertainment industry, take that thought and just pull it out of your head. The idea that, well, that was my idea. Yeah, you know what? I had a lot of ideas on a lot of products. I don't own them, right? And for that matter, the people who are working on Last Regiment had a lot of ideas that they don't own, right? There are people working on Last Regiment that came up with the idea for a character. Does that mean they own that character? No, I paid them to make that idea for that character. And when I paid them, that meant I own it. In the same way that if I paid you to build my house, you can't come and say, well, I built your house, dude. I own it. No. I paid you to build my house. That's my house now. And so a publisher has the exact same feeling to a developer. hey, I made Awakening. That was my creative product. No, we paid you to make Awakening. It's now ours. And Big Fish is totally right to feel that way. I can't complain about that. If I didn't want it to be that way, I should have not taken their money. I should have gone. And in fact, it's interesting. There were other people during that golden age of hidden object games that did pay to make their own games. A very good friend of mine, a guy named Steve, who runs Blue Tea Games, he made a series of games called Dark Parables. And when he made Dark Parables, he did his relationship with his publisher differently. Instead of taking a prepaid royalty from Big Fish, he said, I don't need any of your money. I will spend my money. I will make this game on my own. Then I will come to you and I will treat you not as a publisher, but as a distributor. You're just a distribution channel. And I will self-publish my own game and I will let you distribute me. And when he did that, he earned a much higher royalty percentage. He also owns the IP. And so now, years and years later, I can't make a new Awakening game because I don't own the IP. But Steve, he still owns Dark Parables. And so he's actually got a team making a Dark Parables game. And he can do that forever if he wants. As long as he wants to make Dark Parables games, he can make Dark Parables games. That's a freedom that I don't have. And he bought that freedom because he was the guy that paid for the development of his games. That's a critical part of the sort of three levers, right? And the IP lever is really straightforward. Who paid for it? I paid for it. I own it. Oh, you paid for it? You own it. Now, that's sort of the basics. Now, since then, a lot of shit has changed. Obviously, one of the biggest changes has been digital distribution, and that changes everything. Suddenly, that because back in the day, we used to say like, okay, Best Buy promises me that I'm going to give you X amount of shelf space at Walmart, and okay, that's worth something, that has value, right? Shelf space now is much more difficult to offer because there is unlimited shelf space. You can put as many games as you want on Amazon or Steam. And instead of shelf space being the feature or the thing that matters, what matters is the featuring, right? How much am I going to push you up, right? So if we look at our big digital distributors, the Google Play and the iTunes App Store, we look at Steam, we look at Amazon, all of these digital distribution platforms, what they now offer is the ability for anyone to publish anything, right? Because there's no gatekeeper on. There's kind of a gatekeeper. You have to, your game has to run and shit. But Steam, there's some pretty crappy games on Steam, and Steam's happy to put them up there. They don't care. They got infinite amounts of shelf space to put stuff in. They're just not going to feature the crappy stuff very much. And so the crappy stuff kind of has to stand and fail on its own. And most of it obviously fails, right? But this is a thing that used to not happen. It used to be if you had a crappy little garage game, Walmart only has this much space on their shelf. They're not gonna take a copy of World of Warcraft off the shelf that they know they're going to be able to sell and replace it with your crappy little GarageBand game. They wouldn't do that. But now you can do that. And so now everything's changed. Now the crappy little GarageBand game, which may actually be a really good game, has a chance that it used to not have in the old system where you had to somehow get a publisher to get you the space at Walmart or whatever. That gatekeeper has been removed from the equation and replaced with a new gatekeeper, which is, are you going to be featured or are you not going to be featured? And the featuring decision is partially up to the gatekeepers at Steam or whatever, but those people are making their decisions based on real data, real metrics. And so they're going to look at your game and say, well, your game seems to be performing well. Let's move it up the charts and blah, blah, blah. So now there's this whole sort of series of math equations that have replaced the old gatekeeper of, does a guy at Walmart think my game is cool when he saw it at E3? That thing doesn't exist anymore. And that's now replaced with everything. And, someone over in chat is now saying that's not just games, it's everything. Yeah, that's exactly true. And especially for media. It used to be, I could have almost this exact same conversation about the music industry and how hard it was to get a publisher and blah, blah, blah. But now anybody can get themselves on YouTube and blah, 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 blah. There's a whole thing about that. And this has changed everything. So that's the first thing that's changed everything. The second thing that has changed everything is pricing has changed radically. Back in the olden days of putting your game on a shelf at Walmart, there were a limited number of distributors, and those distributors had real costs. Somebody had to manufacture the CD. Somebody had to put the CD in a shrink wrap that had to be put in the box. The box had to be put in the truck. The truck had to drive somewhere. Someone had to unload the truck. All of these are real costs. And all those costs went away, right? And so when those costs went away, there was an incentive to start dropping the price. And now we have an industry that instead of games that cost $50 or $60, you can still buy a $50 or $60 game, but most games don't sell at those kind of price points. A lot of games are selling at the price point of $12, $9, $6, $3, 99 cents. And then, we can get all into the free-to-play discussion, but you get down to, all right, well, now I've basically got to give my game away for free, and then after I give my game away for free, I got to put things in there that might give them a chance to spend money if they want to spend money, and that's where whole free-to-play and all that. So that whole thing has radically changed this equation as well. So this is a very long-winded way to tell you that's how the game industry sort of started and where it's gone. I could go on and on about this, but I think people are going to get bored pretty quick, and I think most people know a lot of this stuff. That gets us to, how do you run an independent game studio financially in this world? Why does Boomzap do things the way that it does? People ask questions like, over in chat, somebody says, couldn't you go license Awakening and make your own Awakening game? Yeah, sure, we could do that. But honestly, is that the best license for us? I mean, if I were going to go license something, I can license anything. The fact that I made it doesn't give it any sort of special credibility to me. There's a good argument for me saying, why don't I go license Hello Kitty and put my Match 3 game in a Hello Kitty game? Hello Kitty's a way bigger license than Awakening is, right? So, I mean, at the point where I got to go license my own IP, why not just license anybody's IP? But I got sidetracked there. What I wanted to talk about was, how do you run an independent game studio under sort of these conditions? And what we have come to, and what has been relatively successful for us, is to think of things as a risk portfolio, right? So right now, my project, my game company is engaged in 3 major projects. We do some other stuff on the edges, but we have 3 major projects happening in our studio. 1, Last Regiment. You see that right there. That game. That's the number one thing that we're, well, not the number one thing, but it's one of the things that we're doing. And this is actually a small part of my studio. Boomzap, I think, is 30 some odd people. I don't know exactly how many. Monica, tell me how many people we are, Monica. I don't actually remember. I think we're 32, 33, something like that, with some people doing outsource work as well. But full-time, I think we got 30 some odd people in the studio right now. So of those 30 some odd people, I think we have 5 of them full-time working on Last Regiment. So we're not the biggest part of this studio. This is just the most visible part, because this is the self-funded part. This is the part that we're funding ourselves. We don't have a publisher involved at all. We're actually going to take this thing to Steam and use Steam as a distributor. So in that sense, this is a self-published indie title. So that's why you see a lot of Last Regiment in our marketing materials, and because this is something we can market. I've got 2 other projects. One of those projects we're working on in a traditional, what we call work for hire deal, which means some publisher came to us with their intellectual property and said, we have this IP, we have some money, we'd like you to make a game for us. And I said, great. And we moved the prepaid royalties up a little bit higher because it's not my IP. And we moved the back end down a little lower because, again, it's not my IP and it's their license and they don't want to pay that much back end. And we're going to make that game. And if that game does well, we'll make some money. But the real truth is, the percentages of that mean that even if that game does astonishingly well, we don't make that much money. We make most of our money on development, right? And so that's a very conservative deal for my studio. Now, the nice thing about that conservative deal for my studio is, if that game does very poorly, we still make money. We still do all right, right? Because we make most of our money on development. So that's a very low risk option for my studio. And I can use that extra money that we pick up from our low risk option. I can put that together with some of the royalties that we've made from other games, and I can put together a budget to do self-published stuff like Last Regiment. Now, the third project that we're working on is actually a what we call co-funded deal. And I wish I could tell you more about these, but I'm not allowed to. But in a deal like this, we're actually working with a publisher, but in that relationship, we're doing the game basically at cost because we wanted to have the back-end royalties higher. because it's a different deal. And so that for us is a medium risk game. We could actually lose some money on that. Not a lot of money, but we could lose a little bit of money on that game if it does incredibly poorly. But we're in a position to make more money if that game does better. And because it's a co-developed deal, later on, when that game is at a higher stage of production, we'll probably be working with their marketing people, and you'll probably hear from us about that game because we'll probably be working with them in marketing on that. So it's a different relationship. And so those are kind of three different ways that you can make games. And having an independent studio that's doing all three of those ways of making a game creates a real stability for the studio, because we have some games that are going to make games pretty much regardless. Some that are going to probably not lose us money, but, you know, if we do make money, we'll make a lot more money. And then some games that are very high risk. So that's kind of where we are. Over in chat, people are asking, what's the timelines on these? Again, I can't give you too much details on any of this. I can tell you within this year, you'll know more about the co-developed game. And it's a very cool game. I wish I could tell you more. I'm really proud of it. It's a really fun thing, and you'll hear me talk about it, and I'll probably be streaming it and stuff later. It's a cool game. Has nothing to do with Callasia, has nothing to do with Last Regiment. It's not a strategy game. It's not turn-based. Has nothing to do with this whole thing. But it is a cool game. So that's sort of the answer to the question. The punchline to all of this, of course, is this is all based on a question that Paj asked, and Paj isn't even here. So there we go. That's more than you ever wanted to know about the business of making games. If anyone heard all this and you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions. I'll talk more about this other stuff later, but I don't know. Maybe that's interesting for you guys.